Hello and welcome to India Autism Center's webinar on understanding and working with problem behaviors by Dr. Neil Martin. Dr. Martin has been working as a behavior analyst, as a clinician, academic, supervisor, and researcher since 1990. He was among the first handful of board-certified behavior analysts in the UK and was one of the lecturers in the ABA Lecturers Cooperative who developed the first BACB verified course sequence in the UK. Dr. Martin has worked independently for many years, teaching on a number of BACB verified course sequences, helping to establish others around the world, supervising students, and consulting to numerous organizations and families, both in the UK and internationally. He has published research in journals such as Journal of Applied Behavior Analysts, The Behavior Analyst, Research in Developmental Disabilities, and the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And he has a special interest in the use of technology, media, and software related to teaching and research. Dr. Martin was one of the international subject matter experts who last reviewed the BACB task list and who generated the BACB Autism Task List and the BACB Professional and Ethical Compliance Code for Behavior Analysts. In April 2015, Dr. Martin became the BACB Director of International Development to help advance the BACB's global vision to expand the number of behavior analysts and training courses worldwide. I'm Sakshi Singhi, Project Coordinator at India Autism Center, a first-of-its-kind integrative community project coming up in Bengal. You can know more about it by clicking on the links in the chat box or following our social media pages. I'll also be attaching India Autism Center's brochure for your perusal. Before we begin the webinar, know that we'll be fielding questions today at the end of the session. However, you can ask your questions anytime by clicking on the chat box. When you click on the chat box, address your questions to the moderator. The moderator will address your questions towards the end of the webinar. If you have any general questions about India Autism Center, address the questions to India Autism Center in the chat box. An e-certificate of attendance will be sent to you within 4 working days from the webinar. If you have any queries about not receiving e-certificates from previous webinars, then write to us on the email ID and the WhatsApp information that I'll be sharing shortly. These queries and concerns need to be taken up within 48 hours from the webinar. It is also mandatory that you fill the form within 48 hours. We'll be circulating the Google link of the form before the question and answer session, and I suggest you save it and fill it out after the webinar is over. If the form is not filled within 48 hours, we will not be able to give you a certificate of attendance. After filling out the form, you'll be receiving the e-certificate after 4 working days from the date of the webinar. Please note that according to our new webinar policies, we'll be uploading the webinar a month after the date of it. Please follow our YouTube page to stay updated. I'll be sharing all our social media handles shortly. I'll be locking the meeting room in the next 10 minutes, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Martin.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Excellent. And you can see my slides?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. Okay, so just to start by saying that despite the fact that I am the BACB's Director of International Development, this presentation is my own presentation and does not represent any official position of the BACB. I've also kept it fairly general because I wasn't sure exactly who would be on this webinar, although I noticed that there are very many of you, which is wonderful. And I'm only sorry I couldn't be there in person to do this, but perhaps sometime in the near future that will be able to happen. So let me start by framing the presentation. Understanding why problem behavior occurs is probably one of the biggest contributions in terms of behavior analysts, leading on from the days of behavior modification in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the contribution is in terms of thinking of problem behavior well, and indeed any behavior, in terms of its function rather than its form. So it's much more important to know why the behavior occurs rather than what the behavior looks like. So with that in mind, I'd like to focus on problem behavior. And I'd like to start by showing you a definition of problem behavior. And there are two definitions, but this is probably the most obvious one in terms of the one people probably most associate with problem behavior when we talk about problem behavior. And that is behavior of such intensity, frequency, or duration that the physical safety of the person or others is likely to be placed in serious jeopardy. So that is to say that the problem behavior may be a significant problem for the people around the individual, or it could be a significant problem for the individual themselves. But another definition of problem behavior that's probably less well considered generally is this one: behavior which is likely to seriously limit or delay access to and use of ordinary community facilities or impair personal growth, development, and family life. So the kinds of problem behaviors that I'm talking about there are things like stereotypy, where the behavior can occur continuously, such as hand flapping or rocking. And although it's not dangerous and it's not of no concern to others in terms of physical safety, it's behavior that is really denying the individual access to learning opportunities, social opportunities, and so on. And that's a big issue in schools where, for example, teachers may say to me, oh, he's fine, he's just engaging in stereotypy, but it's not a problem, I don't have to attend to him. But that's not the issue. The issue is that the problem behavior is limiting that individual's access to learning opportunities. Okay, what makes a behavior a problem? Well, its context is very important, of course. So where it occurs is an issue. I could have a temper tantrum at home over something with my wife and my son, especially under lockdown. And that wouldn't really be an issue. They would tell me off, they would tell me to pull myself together, and that would be the end of it. But if I was to have a temper tantrum on a bus or a train or in a supermarket, that could make it a much bigger problem. How often it occurs makes a behavior a problem. So a one-off, I don't know, slap to one's head or tap to the head in frustration is very different to that occurring repeatedly hundreds of times an hour. How severe it is also an issue. So I could tap my head, I could flick my head, but if I was to hit myself so hard that I caused bruising or drew blood, then clearly that would be a much bigger problem. And how long the behavior continues is also a major consideration. So a temper tantrum lasting a minute is not the same as a temper tantrum lasting 3 hours. And really, it's a combination of all of those things. So where it occurs, how often it occurs, how severely it occurs, and for how long it continues. A combination of all of those factors really determine whether you could truly consider a problem a behavior problem or not. And there are all sorts of checklists that you can use to rate all of those things. In fact, I could make one available to the India Autism Centre at the end of this for them to post with other resources. Okay, here are some other risk factors. Men are more likely to engage in problem behavior than women, for reasons where we could speculate about, but will not now with the time we have for this presentation. You are more likely to engage in problem behavior between the age of 15 and 35. But as you get older, you may engage in problem behavior as a result of dementia. The degree of your developmental disability is a risk factor. The more severe or profound the disability, the more likely you are to engage in problem behavior. And I think that's probably self-evident, because the more severe or profound your developmental disability, the less skills you have in terms of communicating with others around you. Settings can be an issue. Those that live in or go to institutions where there are many, many individuals and not so many staff, in other words, the amount of attention available in the environment and the amount of activities available in the environment are very sparse, then you are more likely to engage in problem behavior. And if you have some additional secondary impairment, whether it be a physical problem or deficits in communication, then you are more likely to engage in problem behavior. Here are some specific setting conditions. If you have a physical illness, then you may be more likely to engage in problem behavior, and there are some examples here. For example, if you have an allergy, and you're unable to explain that to people, you may end up scratching yourself and hitting yourself because of the itch and the feeling. If you have blocked ears or an ear infection, you may end up hitting your ears, hitting the side of your head, and so on. If you have an underlying mental health problem, and anxiety and depression are the two most common mental health problems worldwide, then you are more likely to engage in problem behavior. Here are some other environmental setting conditions. It could be too light or too dark in a room. It could be too hot or too cold. There could be too few individuals around to offer you support, so inadequate staffing. The proximity of others, similarly, it could be that there is no one in proximity, or it could be that there are too many people in proximity. In terms of there being too many people in proximity, if you were to travel, well, not now under lockdown, but if I was to travel into central London on a train first thing in the morning, I would likely be standing nose to nose with other individuals reading newspapers, and that leads to problem behavior. Then there could be too many additives in food, there could be too many activities or too few activities, and of course, how other people behave has a significant impact on problem behavior itself. Now, we see problem behavior as operant behavior, much as we see all learned behavior as operant behavior. And when I say operant behavior, what I mean is that this is behavior that has been learned as a result of the consequences that occur for that behavior, the reinforcement that occurs for that behavior. And it's safe to assume that in most cases, individuals engage in problem behavior because it is and has been reinforced, and therefore could be said to have a function for that individual. And as I said right at the beginning, for a behavior analyst, problem behaviors therefore are much more usefully referred to in terms of the function for the behavior rather than what the behavior looks like. So someone could go into great detail about what the behavior looks like, but ultimately what I really would need to know is why the behavior occurs, what the function is, what the sources of reinforcement that are maintaining that behavior are. But of course, before we do that, we have to know the problem behavior that we're talking about. So we have to define and describe the behavior. Just to give you an example of why that's important, many years ago, I was asked by a father, well, a family, to help with their son's problem behavior. And so the first thing I asked was, well, explain what the problem behavior is. And they said, he gets anxious. And I said, well, what do you mean? Explain what the behavior is. And they said, well, you know, he gets anxious. And I said, well, I don't know. You have to describe what the behavior looks like. And this went on for a few minutes. And then I started giving suggestions. And I started saying things like, well, does he hit himself? Does he hit you? Does he run away? Does he smash things? And through that process, I was able to get a description of the actual problem behavior that they were describing. And of course, being anxious or anxiety in that context was their explanation for why the problem behavior occurred, although that in itself is not a helpful explanation or description. But anyway, that aside, we need to define and describe the behavior. So we need to choose the specific target behavior that we're looking at, define it in very specific concrete terms, and then use those definitions to determine how often it lasts, how long it lasts, and where it occurs. So, but a behavior definition should be very objective and very observable so that we can see it, we can measure it. It should be clear so that when we see it, we're certain that we are seeing it, and it should be complete. Sorry, the definition should be complete in that we could include examples and non-examples. And I have a couple of worked examples for you. Now, if I was in a small group, I would make this more interactive, but I'm not. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. So here is a problem behavior that I'm calling mouthing, but as yet is not defined. So here is a definition: any instance of Neil putting something into his mouth for no reason. Now, I'm showing you that as an example of how not to define a problem behavior. For multiple reasons. Firstly, there are several things I could put into my mouth that will be entirely appropriate for me to put into my mouth. And secondly, the last part of this definition says for no reason. And it's impossible for you to determine by observing me engage in this behavior whether I have a reason or not, unless you ask me. So you might see me put something into my mouth, then you'd say to me, Neil, is what you're putting into your mouth appropriate, and do you have a reason for doing it? And if the answer to both of those things is yes, then you cannot include that as part of the definition. So this is not a very helpful way of defining it. It's not observable, it's not clear, it's not objective, and it's probably not complete. Here's another definition: any instance of Neil putting object or body parts into mouth past lips for at least 1 second. Well, that's certainly clearer, but what about the things that I could appropriately put into my mouth, like food and drink? And then finally, any instance of Neil putting object or body part into mouth past plane of lips for at least 1 second. So the same as the previous definition, but now I include non-examples to give an idea of the appropriate things I could put into my mouth. Okay, so this is observable, clear, objective, and complete. Okay, here's another quick example: hitting. Any instance of child hitting staff to get a toy or a sweet. Now, I'm putting this up as an example of how not to define a behavior for 2 reasons. Firstly, you wouldn't know by observation whether the child was hitting someone to get a toy or a sweet. You may see them get a toy or a sweet subsequently, but you wouldn't know that that's why they were doing it. That's the function, and that would require a functional analysis, which I'm going to talk about later. The second problem with this definition is it uses the word it's trying to define: any instance of child hitting staff to get a toy or a sweet. So essentially we're saying, well, hitting is hitting, and that's not a very helpful definition. Any instance of child touching a staff member with their hand. Well, touching doesn't really capture the essence of hitting, and there are many ways in which a child could touch a staff member with their hand that would be highly appropriate, if not desirable. And finally, any instance of child making forceful contact between the palm or fist of their hand and any part of the staff member or child's body. Non-examples giving high five. So that's a much more specific definition of hitting in this case, with the possible problem that forceful might need further definition, which is why I put an asterisk next to forceful. And there are different ways you could define forceful. One might be leave some visible mark, or another might be audible. So maybe audible contact might be better than forceful contact. Okay, so now we've defined the problem behavior. The next thing is, to understand the problem behavior, to rule out the possibility that there could be some kind of medical reason why the problem behavior occurs. So this could be, for example, I don't know, ear infection or a toothache or something like that, that in the absence of the individual being able to say to their parents or their teacher, hey, I'm not feeling so great today, I have a really bad toothache, they may be kind of hitting at their mouth or screaming or banging their head or hitting someone next to them and so on. Now, how you might determine that it's a medical cause rather than anything else is if the problem is very specifically localized and the problem occurs unusually. Perhaps you haven't seen this occur before, and it occurs and then it goes away again. So that could be evidence of an underlying medical condition rather than something else. Now, assuming we have defined our behavior, assuming we have ruled out as far as we are able medical causes, then the stage 3 is to determine why the person engages in this problem behavior. And we do this by conducting a functional assessment. And essentially what the functional assessment tells us is what the source of reinforcement for the problem behavior is. That's what we mean by function. So the function is a statement that describes the reinforcers that are maintaining the problem behavior. And when we talk about functional assessment, what we're doing is we're describing the process of establishing a relationship, but not any relationship, a contingent relationship between the behavior and its antecedents, so what triggers the behavior, and its consequences, what is maintaining the behavior through reinforcement. And so we conceptualized the whole assessment as comprising these 3 separate processes. First, we select and define the problem behavior, as I've already described. Second is that we generate some hypotheses ourselves about the likely source of reinforcement for the behavior. And we can do that by talking to parents and teachers and others that know the individual well, asking them questions such as, the last time they engaged in the problem behavior, tell me about that. Tell me what the situation was. Tell me what happened just before. What did you do afterwards? And so on. And that will help us narrow our focus for the assessment process itself. And then the third bit, the important bit, is then we evaluate and provide some data as confirmation of our hypotheses. So then we can say, yes, this problem behavior is maintained by attention from the teacher, or attention from another child, or attention from the parents, or something else. And there could be many, many, many things. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So what we have here are different sets of potential reinforcers. On the left-hand side of the slide, we have problem behavior that is maintained by access to something, so positive reinforcement. And on the right-hand side, we've got problem behavior that's maintained by the removal of something, negative reinforcement. But then those are also subdivided. So if we start at the bottom left and work our way across the columns, the problem behavior could be maintained by access to stimulation, some kind of internal stimulation. It could be visual stimulation. It could be the release of endorphins. It could be many things. It could be the sound of something, the taste of something, and so on. And if the big problem behavior is maintained by access to internal stimulation, we call that automatic reinforcement. In the next column, we have problem behavior that could be maintained by positive reinforcement in the form of obtaining attention. And that could be a smile, a hug, but it could also be a frown. It could be someone shouting at the individual. But it's still a form of attention. Or the next column along, it could be problem behavior that's maintained by positive reinforcement in terms of getting access to an activity or an object that the individual really wants. It could be food, toys, or something else. I used to work with an individual whose problem behavior was maintained by access to cups of tea. And it wasn't that the staff intended to reinforce the problem behavior, but after he'd finished engaging in problem behavior and he calmed down, a little, he would be offered tea. And that eventually came to be the reinforcer for problem behavior. And when he wanted tea, he would engage in problem behavior. And it took us a long time to understand that. Okay, the three columns on the right side of this slide are to do with negative reinforcement. The first is to escape or avoid stimulation. And so, for example, if you have an allergy, you may itch at your skin, scratch your skin in order to avoid the itchy sensation that the allergy creates. If you have a headache and you take paracetamol or aspirin, that has the effect of negatively reinforcing the taking of that medication, because what happens afterwards is that the headache is removed. The next column is about negative reinforcement through escaping or avoiding attention. And it could be that the individual is actually seeking to avoid all of the things that you are doing that you think are reinforcing but are actually not. So it could be that you are far too close. The child doesn't like hugs. They don't like smiles. They don't like being told off. They don't like being told they're wrong or no. And they could engage in problem behavior in order to escape from that. And the final one on the right-hand side is escaping or avoiding activities. And this occurs probably more often in school than any other type of problem behavior, because school, almost by their very nature, is attempting to teach you something new. And where that could be quite hard, the task is hard, the concept is hard, you may not fully understand what it is that the teacher's trying to do, you may engage in problem behavior in order for that task to be removed and you to be given a break. And in that sense, we would talk about negative reinforcement in terms of escape or avoidance of activities. Now, assuming you have these hypotheses before you test them, here are some things that might lead you to consider these various hypotheses. So if you think that the problem behavior might be maintained by access to some kind of internal stimulation, so positive automatic reinforcement, then you are likely to see the problem behavior used by the individual in order to occupy themselves when they have very little else to do. And you are likely to see the behavior occur repeatedly when they're not engaged in any other activity. So important questions to consider in that situation might be, well, are there activities available for the individual? Maybe that would solve the problem. Okay, there are activities available, but are there a good range of activities? Are they activities that the individual will want to engage with, rather than activities that you think they may want to engage with? And are they accessible to the individual? Of course, is a very important consideration. If you think that the problem behavior might be maintained by access to social reinforcement, so attention from someone, then you're likely to see the problem behavior occur when the individual appears to want to interact with them. And of course, as a consequence of that, the problem behavior results in attention being given. Even if it's not necessarily the kind of attention that you would consider reinforcing. So for example, a child desperately wants the attention of their parents. Their parents are engaged in a conversation with one another. The child goes up to them and starts tugging at their legs or pulling them, and mummy, mummy, daddy, 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 and they end up turning around and shouting at the child. Now, that could be a reinforcer in some situations. And that could be a reinforcer because at least it's some attention rather than no attention. And now the attention is on the child where it wasn't before. So important questions to consider here in this context relate to the type of attention that's being given, whether the individual already has opportunities to gain attention appropriately, and something about the quality of the attention. Will they get good one-to-one attention, or does it have to be shared with others? If you're hypothesizing that the problem behavior might be maintained by access to some activity or toy or something, positive, tangible reinforcement, then we're likely to see the problem behavior occur when the individual wants something, so food, drink, a preferred item, or perhaps in order to change an activity to a more enjoyable one. and then gets reinforced because the problem behavior results in the individual getting something. So questions to ask in this situation might be, well, what opportunities does the individual have to gain access to preferred items or activities? You know, if they ask for a biscuit, can they have a biscuit? If they ask to watch a video, can they watch a video? And so on. Okay, and the final one to consider, as I said, very common in schools, I think, this function. Negative reinforcement in the form of escape from something, usually a task or a demand. And you would consider this as your hypothesis if you see the problem behavior occur when the individual's engaged in an activity that they clearly do not enjoy or perhaps don't understand or is simply too difficult for them. And as a consequence of engaging in problem behavior, the task stops. Either the teacher gives them a break or they take it away and give them something else to do, or perhaps they just take it away and nothing else happens. So important questions to ask in this situation might be, do they really have to do the task? Do they really have to? And sometimes the answer to that question is absolutely yes, but sometimes actually, no, they don't have to do the task. Is the task too boring or too hard? So they could be opposite ends of the spectrum. They could not be enjoying the task because they've done it, 100 times before and they just don't want to do it again. It's too boring. And if it is too hard, too difficult, then could you break down the task into smaller steps and present it that way instead? Now, just to give you a broad overview of likely functions associated with likely behaviors, these data come from a paper that was published by Brian Iwata and colleagues at the Florida Center for Self-Injury quite a few years ago now. And really what I wanted to draw your attention to in particular are, well, a couple of things really. Firstly, aggression almost always has a social component because almost by definition, to be aggressive involves someone else. So either it's in terms of getting attention from someone, or it's to avoid social attention from someone. Similarly, tantrums only really occur in the context of some kind of social situation. So someone really has to be there in order for a tantrum to occur. Tantrums tend not to happen in isolation. And same with non-compliant. You really be non-compliant if someone asks you to do something and you don't do it. But the bottom one, I think, is the most interesting. SIB is self-injurious behavior. And that could occur for any reason across any of the functions. And for that reason, one can make no assumptions about self-injurious behavior in terms of its function. And a functional assessment of some description is almost always mandated for a problem behavior involving self-injurious behavior, because to get it wrong could be a costly error. And so it's really important that people understand what the function is, not make assumptions. Okay, so let's move on to the different types of functional assessment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of my time doing this because my expectation is that many of you could be doing 1 and 2, but certainly not 3. 3 requires a lot of additional training. So the types of functional assessment are, firstly, some form of indirect assessment or anecdotal analysis. And I will take you through some examples of how we might do that. The second is what's called a direct naturalistic observation or a descriptive analysis. And I will also take you through some examples of what that looks like. And the third is to conduct some kind of experimental manipulation, what behavior analysts call a functional analysis rather than a functional assessment. And it's an analysis because it involves experimental manipulation in order to determine likely function. And I will describe that in a bit. Okay, so the first of these, indirect assessment and anecdotal analysis, it requires that you focus on the circumstances on which the behavior occurs retrospectively. So it's based on informed recall. So, the example I gave earlier, you might ask you would ask the parents, the teachers, and others that know the individual well, spend time with them. You would say, tell me about the last episode when they engaged in problem behavior. What was going on? What happened just before? What happened afterwards? Just give me some context. And then you would say, okay, what about the time before that? Okay, and what about the time before that? Now, that's a problem, of course, because you rely on the fact that people are able to remember in significant detail all of this information. And that's why you would never rely on such an assessment to determine function. You would use such a method in order to identify hypotheses that you could explore using the other methods. Here's an example of an assessment that you could give to people and ask them to fill in. It involves 16 fairly straightforward questions, 4 questions related to each of 4 functions, and you ask the recipient of this assessment scale to answer the question on a 0 to 6 scale. You ask the question, then you say, if the answer is never, it's 0. If the answer is always, it's 6. If it's kind of somewhere in between, then it's somewhere in between. And I should say, this was designed to use with children exhibiting self-injurious behavior. I still think it's a fairly useful tool anyway. Here are some examples of the first 4 questions. Question 1, would the behavior occur continuously over and over if this person was left alone for long periods of time? Now, this question is clearly designed to determine whether the behavior is likely to be maintained by some kind of internal stimulation, automatic reinforcement. The second question, does the behavior occur in request to perform a difficult task? So this is a question that's designed to tease out whether the function actually relates to escape from something. The third question, does the behavior seem to occur in response to you talking to other persons in the room? So this question is designed to tease out whether the behavior is maintained by access to attention. And then question 4, does the behavior ever occur to get a toy, food, or activity that this person has been told that they cannot have? So this question is designed to try and find out whether the behavior is maintained by some kind of tangible reinforcement, access to something. And there are another 12 questions. And what you do is you answer the questions, you add up all the answers in the various categories. So you have your categories are automatic reinforcement, attention, escape, tangible, and then you look for the biggest score. And that's a hypothesis for you to test. But I would never give this assessment to less than 3 people. And if all 3 people came up with very similar data in terms of indicating a particular function, then I would go ahead and test that. If you gave it to 3 people and they came up with very different responses in terms of potential functions, I would simply tear these up and do something else. Okay, the next of the functional assessments is direct naturalistic observation, or conducting a descriptive analysis. So in this situation, I would actually go and directly observe the circumstances in which the behavior occurs, ideally in as naturalistic a condition as possible. So I would go into the classroom, into the home, into the situation where I see the problem behavior. And I've been on buses, trains, many different situations in order to observe the behavior actually occur under naturalistic conditions. And you are making a note of exactly when it's occurring and ideally what's happening before and afterwards. Just in terms of when it's occurring, here's something called a scatter plot. And what happens with a scatter plot is you are recording, excuse me, you are recording at half-hour intervals whether the behavior occurred or not. So we call this partial interval recording. In this example, If the behavior does not occur, you simply don't put anything in that particular box. I should say the horizontal axis is days, and the vertical axis are times, starting at 7 o'clock in the morning, going through to 8 p.m. And so what you would do is you observe on a particular day, and if the behavior occurs within a half-hour slot, at a low rate, you partially shade the box. At a high rate, you fully shade the box. Now, these are real data, and these were data I collected many, many years ago. And the problem behavior was the child was wetting himself. And this was a 15-year-old child, so this was quite an unusual behavior. And what we were able to determine fairly clearly through these data was that the behavior is only really occurring in the morning. I mean, there were some other occasions, but generally it's fairly reliably occurring in the morning between about 9 and 10:30. And what that helped us to do was focus our more detailed functional assessments and functional analysis between these times. And we would not have necessarily known that had we not collected these data. As it turned out, the reason why this individual was wetting himself between these times was because that was the time of day when he had a particular staff member that he was very fond of working with him, and she happened to be a young and attractive female, and he was a 15-year-old boy. And what happened when he wet himself was that she would take him to the toilet and change him, and he quite liked that, and that was the reinforcer. Many of you will have heard of and probably will have used ABC data. ABC stands for antecedent behavior consequence. The idea here is that when you see the problem behavior occur, you write down the problem behavior in the center column, then you write down what happened immediately before in the antecedent column, and then what happened immediately afterwards in the consequence column. And I call these an unstructured data collection because it allows you to pretty much write in whatever you want in the antecedent consequence column, and indeed in the behavior column. And it's very difficult if different people fill these in to then collate categories because the way people write them can vary tremendously. So I find these a bit of a headache, and I have always preferred to use a much more structured method of collecting ABC data, where I predetermine the behavior at the top. This is a daily recording form, so I put the date in at the top. And then every time that behavior occurs, and only that behavior, whoever is working with the individual, or if it's at home, if the parents are with the individual, they simply tick the relevant antecedents and the relevant consequences. And what I used to say to people, I say used to because I haven't done this for many years, given my current role. I say, when you have at 30 incidents recorded, 30 ticks, and it may require many days of data, give them to me and I will analyze them. And if they're telling me something useful, then I will pursue that with a functional analysis. But if they're not telling me anything useful, then it's probably not worth you continuing to record it. So you can stop now. So either way, I kind of set a cutoff point of 30 or so incidents before I looked at the data and either determined I was going to pursue a very specific type of functional analysis, or I would simply do something else, but I'd ask them to stop collecting the data at that point. Here are this is how I would categorize the data from such an assessment. I had already predetermined the consequences, so I simply added up the number of times that the consequences were recorded and graphed them in terms of the overall percentage occurrence. And what this tells me in this particular case is that by far the most consequences were that whatever the problem behavior was, and I can't remember what it was now, that the individual was given a task activity or an instruction. This is as a consequence. So what this suggests as a hypothesis is that this individual was bored and they were engaging in problem behavior in order to get access to something, some activity or something. So that was the hypothesis we drew from these data. It's interesting when I show these data in presentations and I say to people, what do you think the function is? Many people say, oh, well, it must be escape, or because it's given a task activity and instruction. But then I say, no, this is not an antecedent. This is a consequence. This is what happened after the problem behavior occurred. So it's important to look at the labels and the graphs. Okay, the third type of functional assessment is actually not really an assessment at all. It's an analysis and involves an experimental manipulation. And this is an assessment that involves deliberately manipulating environmental events and then observing the effect that has on the frequency of the target behavior. Here is a seminal paper that was published in 1982 by Iwata and colleagues. This is still considered by many the gold standard way of conducting a functional analysis. So I'll very briefly explain what's happening here. What you do is once you've identified the problem behavior you're assessing, you put the individual in these different conditions, the attention condition, the demand condition, the alone condition, and the control condition. And typically these conditions last for 10 to 15 minutes only, and you repeat them a number of times. Now, during the attention condition, the individual is ignored. That's the antecedent. So they're not getting any attention. And then when problem behavior occurs, you give attention to the problem behavior. But you give attention in the form of, oh, don't do that. Stop that. You'll help yourself. You'll hurt yourself. That's not right. Don't do that. That kind of attention. So what you're aiming to do in the attention condition is deliberately reinforce problem behavior with attention in order to see whether it functions as a reinforcer. And if it does, and you get more problem behavior in that condition compared to any others, then you could conclude from that it is highly likely that the problem behavior is maintained by attention. In the second condition, you present learning trials. Maybe you ask the person to do something that's too difficult or too boring, too complex. And then if they engage in problem behavior, then you just remove the tasking activity for a period of time. And after that period of time, you reintroduce the demand again. And if the problem behavior occurs again, you remove the demand again. So what you're doing in this condition is you're deliberately trying to reinforce the problem behavior negatively by removing the task. And if you get more problem behavior in this condition, it's likely because the individual is trying to escape from demands. In the alone condition, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. The individual is in a condition with no social contact, nothing to do. There's no activities or toys in there. Of course, because there's no one in there, or there's no social contact, then no programmed consequence occurs. And if you have more problem behavior in this condition, then you could probably conclude that the behavior is lightly reinforced automatically just by access to some kind of internal stimulation. And because this is an experimental analysis, there's a control condition. And so essentially you compare the data from the other three conditions to this control condition. And the control condition is designed to provide a situation where problem behavior is extremely unlikely to occur. And that is because that you have access to attention in that condition, and you have access to items and activities, indeed, maybe your favorite items and activities. And so you certainly have no need to engage in problem behavior to get attention, because you have attention if you wish. You have no reason to engage in problem behavior to escape from anything, because you're not being asked to do anything. And you have no real reason to engage in problem behavior for internal stimulation, because you have access to your favorite toys and activities. And you run these for, as I say, a number of times, and then you look at the data. So let's look at some data. Here are real data from an individual who engaged in a kind of scratching behavior. He used to scratch his leg vigorously. Sometimes he would make it bleed. and we conducted the analysis because the parents were absolutely adamant they knew why he did it, and he did it in order to escape from tasks, and therefore we should change the way we were teaching him. And that's not what our data told us at all. What the data show fairly clearly is that the highest levels of problem behavior occurred actually when he was alone, and actually he was engaged in a kind of self-stimulatory, automatically reinforced problem behavior that he seemed to quite enjoy and would engage in for long periods of time in the absence of anything else to do. And actually that was an argument for us increasing the kinds of things we were doing in the classroom and give him less breaks, because when he had breaks, he would engage in more problem behavior. So it was really important that we did the analysis. I should also say, for those of you that may not be familiar with single study research designs, this is what we would call a multi-element design, in that we are concurrently comparing the effects of 4 different conditions, in this case, alone, attention, control, and demand, and running across different sessions. And so the way the data are graphed, it allows you to determine the different sessions in which these different conditions occurred. Okay, let's talk about intervention methods fairly briefly. By the way, can someone tell me how long I've got left? Is it 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I'm going to break these intervention methods down into these 3 sections. Proactive, where you engage in interventions in order to prevent problem behavior from occurring in the first place. We also call these antecedent interventions. The second are, I would call, active intervention methods. Essentially, we focus on teaching other behaviors as replacement behaviors. And the third, C, are reactive intervention methods, because you still need to know what to do when problem behavior occurs, whilst the other interventions are in place. So proactive strategies or antecedent interventions. One really easy thing to do, well, I say it's easy, at least conceptually it's easy to do, is if you have conducted a functional assessment and you know what the reinforcer is, and let's say hypothetically it's attention, then a proactive intervention, an antecedent intervention, could be that you simply give access to attention at fixed intervals, period, not contingent on anything. So you may say to the teacher, I want you to go over and exchange a few words, say, hey, you're doing a great job. I really like the way you're working, and pat them on the back. And I want you to do that every minute throughout the class. And that's it. Doesn't matter whether they're engaging in problem behavior or not. Every minute, I want you to do this. Now, where that's likely to be successful is if the problem behavior is occurring a lot less frequently than 1 minute. Then if you are giving access to the reinforcer, although in this case it's not a reinforcer because you're giving it non-contingently, if you're giving access to attention much more frequently than they engage in problem behavior, then the logic here is there's no real reason anymore to engage in problem behavior, because you have access to the thing that you're engaging in problem behavior for anyway, without having to do anything. So we call that non-contingent reinforcement, and I really hate that term because reinforcement by definition is not non-contingent, but that's another presentation for another time. Another proactive strategy is to make sure that you embed plenty of opportunities for choice, control over what's happening in the environment, and some level of predictability in the environment, perhaps through offering options to the individual at various points. Okay, so would you like to do A, B, or C now, rather than we are going to do this? Now, I appreciate that's not always possible, certainly not always possible in a classroom situation, but there are times when you can do that. Another easy, conceptually anyway, proactive strategy is to offer appropriate, engaging, and fun activities, at least multiple times during the session. Another antecedent intervention is to modify the environment or structure if that's absolutely necessary. maybe move the individual into a position where it's easier to get attention from the teacher, or you know, sit with them when they're engaged in their homework so that they can ask for your help, and so on. Now, don't forget, when you're engaging in actually any of these strategies that I'm going to talk about, don't forget that when the individual does engage in appropriate behavior, make sure that's reinforced, and ideally reinforced with the same reinforcer that's maintaining problem behavior. Excuse me, hay fever, at least here in the UK. So we call that differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So don't forget, when the child is, or the individual is, engaging in the behaviors that you wish to see, you know, appropriate behaviors, make sure that's reinforced. Often that's forgotten. You know, I rarely see teachers in classrooms reinforce appropriate behaviors, but I often see them try and punish problem behaviors, and that's a general problem. And ideally, try and reinforce appropriate behaviors in the absence of problem behavior. Okay, the next strategy, I'm calling it an active strategy. This is about teaching new ways, new behaviors, so that you don't have to react to problem behaviors. You know, try and identify what the reinforcer is. If the reinforcer is attention, teach them a more effective way of gaining attention. Teach them effective communication strategies so they don't have to engage in problem behavior in order to communicate whatever it is they're communicating. Teach coping strategies. One of the things I personally find very difficult with generally is when I have to wait for things, and when I don't know how long I have to wait for things. I find that very stressful. And so I have my own coping strategies for dealing with that. Now, whatever you're teaching, if you're teaching a child to raise a hand, for example, in order to request attention, rather than hit their head or hit the child next to them, make sure, at least initially, that whatever it is you're teaching is more effective than the problem behavior. So if the child puts their hand up to request attention, make sure they get attention immediately. If they don't, they'll go back to problem behavior, because problem behavior will be more effective at getting attention. And certainly in a classroom situation, there is nothing more effective than getting the teacher's attention, than either whacking yourself so hard that you draw blood, or even better, whacking the child next to you so hard that you draw blood. Guaranteed you'll get the teacher's attention very quickly if you do that. So if you're teaching another strategy, make sure it's as effective, but ideally more effective than problem behavior. And then you'll gradually fade that out over time, and gradually you know, say, okay, I see you, just wait 1 second. But, you know, that you fade those kinds of things out over time. Okay, here are some alternatives to teach, obviously based on what the function of the behavior is. But these are all really important skills that individuals need to know anyway. So how to ask for help appropriately, how to say this is too difficult, rather than throw it or break it or hit someone. How to say I need a break when you need a break. Everyone needs a break. How to know when things are starting and finishing. And as I mentioned about myself, how to wait. Okay, and the final one, you still need to know what to do when the individual engages in problem behavior. You know, with the greatest efforts in the world, using our other proactive and active interventions aren't necessarily going to reduce problem behavior to zero immediately. So it may still occur at some level. The first thing to do, which is a lot easier said than done, is don't reinforce the problem behavior. I mean, it sounds obvious. If you know the problem behavior is maintained by escape, don't let them escape contingent on problem behavior. Make them finish what they're doing and then give them a break. If you know the problem behavior is maintained by attention, don't give them attention when they engage in problem behavior. Say nothing. When problem behavior is finished, then you can give attention. Well, I say nothing. I say nothing, but sometimes what you may have to do is the second one here, give clear and unambiguous instructions about what they do need to do. And that might be, hey, you need to stand up, or you need to sit down, or you need to be quiet, something like that. But no more than that, very clear and very ambiguous. And and always reinforce appropriate behaviors, again, in the absence of the problem behavior, if you can. So we're back to differential reinforcement of alternatives, alternative behavior. Now, I whiz through this very quickly, and let me just say one more thing about the first of these. Do not reinforce the problem behavior. Now, we call that extinction. If we know what the problem behavior, if we know what the reinforcer for the problem behavior is, and it's not providing attention contingent on problem behavior, is called extinction. But what happens when you use extinction, almost invariably, is in the short term, you get an increase in problem behavior to start with. And then probably because the individual learns fairly quickly that the reinforcer is not forthcoming, then it reduces to zero. But if you are in a situation where you cannot tolerate problem behavior continuing to occur, and you certainly cannot tolerate problem behavior getting worse before it gets better, then just don't use extinction. Just do not use that. It could become dangerous, perhaps. Okay, let me just finish by giving you examples of things not to do. These are generally unhelpful things to do. And I'm offering you these because I have seen on many occasions people doing just this, even though they're really unhelpful things to do. The first is telling someone what not to do instead of what to do. So telling someone, hey, you need to stop having a tantrum is really not very helpful to someone who's having a tantrum. But you need to stand up, or you need to sit down, or you need to come over here, or you need to pick that up. It's very specific and concrete, and that's something that someone can follow. But stop having that tantrum is not, generally speaking, pretty unhelpful, especially if you're having a tantrum. Don't threaten with possible consequences if you can't follow through with that. So here's my example. If you throw that, you won't watch TV tonight. Now, if you make a statement like that, you've got to be prepared that if they throw it, they will not watch TV tonight, and the consequences of that. Now, if you're not prepared to deal with the consequences of that, do not threaten with a possible consequence. The other funny one I often hear is I hear parents say to their children, if you do that one more time, I'm going to take it away from you. And then you watch and they do it one more time, and the parent says, I told you, if you do that one more time, I'm going to take it away from you. And that might occur for a number of different occasions. If you do that one more time is very concrete. So if you do that one more time, I will take that away from you. That should mean, if you do that one more time, I'll take that away from you. And people should follow through with that, if that's genuinely what they mean. And the last of these is that in our attempts to often be incredibly polite, we may often present a direction that's phrased as a question or a choice when actually it's not, and that's not very helpful. So perhaps you may say something like, hey, would you like to come and have your dinner now? When actually what you mean is, you need to come over in here and sit down because we are eating dinner now. But saying it like that, would you like to come over here and have your dinner now, opens up the possibility that the individual may say, no, it's okay, thanks, I'll carry on watching television. And actually, that's not what you meant, but you only embedded a choice or a question in your attempt to be polite in what was actually a direction. Okay, so here's my summary slide, and then we can open this up for questions. So problem behavior is better understood. Problem behavior is better understood in terms of its function. There are multiple risk factors and setting events for problem behavior, and I've taken you through some of them. Problem behavior must be operationally defined in order to assess it. The function of problem behavior is identified through the process of conducting a functional assessment. And the interventions for problem behavior that I've simplified and broken down for you are in the categories of being proactive, active, and reactive. Okay, thank you very much.